Are we alone? It's a fascinating question that's captivated humanity for thousands of years, and we're only just starting to maybe be able to find an answer to it. Until that fateful day, though, the most we can do aside from search is to simply imagine what those worlds and creatures might be like. Aliens are, of course, extremely popular subjects in sci-fi media and other, science shows, but science-based programming, seriously exploring astrobiology, the study of what life might be like beyond Earth, has been relatively few and far between to my knowledge. Among that short list, the obvious pinnacle of this fairly niche genre is Discovery Channel's 2005 special, Alien Planet. Based on the work of sci-fi artist Wayne D. Barlow's book, Expedition, the show presents a hypothetical look at what an unmanned expedition to an exoplanet might be like, told through the story of two AI-driven probes who are sent to investigate the mysterious Darwin 4. I plan to eventually give a full and proper review of Alien Planet at some point, but suffice it to say that I loved this show as a kid, and I include it among what I consider to be the pantheon of great CGI natural history documentaries, even though it's all, fake, and about aliens. I bring it up though because, as you may have known before seeing and clicking on this video, Netflix recently took a step into this genre with their brand new offering, Alien Worlds. The trailer dropped sometime in mid-November, and it looked promising enough to catch my attention, and since we've really been lacking this type of content, of course, I gave it a watch within the first day of its December 2nd release. I actually wasn't planning to review it, but I ended up having a lot of thoughts that I wanted to put out there, and see if other people felt the way I did about it. I swear only 1% of my motivation was to try writing the algorithm or whatever the phrase is that YouTubers use, though by the time this video gets released, the buzz will probably have passed anyway. Before I continue further, I would be remiss not to point out that even though a lot of people were seemingly looking forward to what amounted to an Alien Planet revamp, Alien Worlds actually shares a lot more similarities with Extraterrestrial, a two-part National Geographic special from 2005 that also looked at hypothetical alien life. And I do mean a lot of similarities. Unlike the more narrative-driven Alien Planet, both Nat Geo and Netflix shows hop between a different planet every episode and present a handful of species living in a particular environment on said planet, interspersed with ample commentary from scientists explaining various aspects of these hypothetical worlds and drawing parallels to how we understand life functions on Earth. I've seen a fair number of people complaining about this online, but personally I'm a big fan of when shows like this feature scientists in this way. I think it helps ground the program enough to not come across as baseless fantasy, and, if done well, can introduce viewers to a variety of concepts along the way. Alien Worlds definitely had this aim in mind, but as I'll get into shortly, it drastically misses the mark. This won't be too in-depth of a review, but there's not much to actually spoil, so I will be mentioning various examples from throughout the show pretty freely. The beginning of the first episode introduces us to the main theoretical launch point of the series. We meet Didier Queloz, one of the men who co-discovered the first confirmed exoplanet orbiting a star, and co-won a Nobel Prize for it. He briefly explains how scientists detect exoplanets and presents the grounding idea that, since there are a very large number of stars that each likely have at least one planet orbiting them, it's statistically impossible for life as we recognize it to just be an Earth phenomenon. After that, the show then launches to the first of the 4 worlds that each have a special feature that their respective episode tries to frame as the main obstacle that life on that planet has to overcome. The first episode presents Atlas, a planet which has an atmosphere twice as dense as Earth's and boasts a number of large aerial life forms as a result. The second episode is about Janus, a tidally locked planet that is so close to its star that it can't rotate on its axis, and so has one side in permanent darkness and the other side in permanent daylight, with a so-called twilight zone in the ring-like region between those two sides. The third episode focuses on Eden, a planet orbiting a binary star system, which means it has 2 suns, and so has a lot more oxygen in its atmosphere than on Earth because of the plant life producing so much oxygen through photosynthesis. The fourth and final episode features a planet called Terra, which is becoming inhospitable and nearing the end of its existence as its dying sun gradually enlarges, threatening to destroy everything orbiting it. Let me start with the positives. While they're not Lion King level graphics, all of these planets and their ecosystems are beautifully rendered and generally well animated. This is Framestore after all, who produced the Emmy-winning visual effects for the Walking With series, among a number of other documentary and Hollywood projects, so of course the visuals are good. British actress Sophie Okonedo provides the voiceover narration, and while her script doesn't always present the best lines, she does an overall decent job at helping to create an otherworldly feel for the series, in addition to the show's underscore, though I'll grant that it wasn't the most memorable I've ever heard.
Astronomers think it's only a matter of time before some alien life forms are discovered. By applying the laws of life on Earth, it's possible to imagine what could live on alien worlds.
As I mentioned earlier, I really appreciate the segments featuring input from various astrobiologists, evolutionary biologists, ecologists, astronomers, and other specialists to provide some real-world conceptual framework for the alien speculation. While I myself wasn't unfamiliar with any of the concepts the show presented in this way, it still offered numerous examples illustrating those concepts that I didn't know about and found fascinating. These scenes are also well shot and very pleasing to look at, with a lot of appropriately gratuitous landscape shots and slow motion close-ups. This show especially gets my praises for featuring what might be one of the most diverse rosters I've ever seen in a nature documentary like this. People from across the age spectrum are here, there's a healthy amount of women representation, and a number of black and brown folks appear as well, all presented on equal ground as experts in their fields. Most importantly, it's clear that all of these people genuinely love what it is they do and study. This moment here, which at least for me was the show's preview clip on the Netflix website, actually won me over and convinced me to watch the series in the first place.
God. This is the most incredible place I think I've ever seen. This is what I dream other planets looking like. It's incredible. So, yeah.
I just really love seeing black people, especially black women in STEM fields that aren't directly tied to medicine or the big tech industries. No disrespect at all to the doctors, coders, nurses, and medical researchers out there. Y'all are the real MVPs, especially in this pandemic year. But when you're young and black and express an interest in STEM, it feels like you're always being pushed by somebody, be it your family, your community, the media you might watch, or the academic spaces you might find yourself in, to directly enter a profession that's seen as useful and where you can make money. This comes from a litany of both obvious and not so obvious reasons that are far beyond the scope of this video, but suffice it to say that actually seeing moments and imagery like this are few and far between, and it warms my heart. Love to see it. Unfortunately, this is about where my praise starts to wear thin, because the show has some problems. The presentation and stories of the alien planets are extremely thin and stretched out into short, disjointed segments throughout the show, and in the second episode there's basically no clear sequence of events, so it's hard to get it all invested in anything going on, even if you're enjoying the visuals. That also makes it hard to take the narration seriously because the script has an increasingly annoying habit of talking about the hypothetical presentations as if they're real and in the present tense. For example, instead of saying, "things will be different on Atlas," Okonedo says, "things are different on Atlas," even when speaking over the Earth footage, and to me it felt forced and slightly patronizing. Alien Planet does much the same thing, and even the scientists talk about the scenarios as if it's something that's actually happening, but because that show's narrative elements are so strong, it feels legitimate enough to be talked about that way. In this respect, little of Alien Worlds feels earned. This problem isn't helped by the fact that there's not that much actual alien sequences, and oftentimes we're treated to the same few clips and shots repeated over and over. I can excuse this somewhat, if only because it's not as egregious as something like Discovery Channel's Clash of the Dinosaurs or Monsters Resurrected, but it was definitely noticeable, and it's a common thread in the negative reviews I've seen from audiences. These are both lower on my list of complaints and critiques though. To me, Alien Worlds has two main and related problems that really hurt this show and made it increasingly frustrating to watch, and both consistently occurred throughout all 4 episodes. The first issue is that these aliens are generally not very well thought out. The designs themselves are overall aesthetically fine and have some interesting features, even though some of them do look a bit too much like modified versions of Earth life, not to mention that plants get no love in this show. But when you design a creature that's supposed to be part of a living ecosystem, with an evolutionary history and such, you have to take those things into consideration and build your creature and its lifestyle based on those principles. For example, the sky grazers of Atlas are said to be so specialized for an airborne life that adults cannot support their own weight on land, and females suffocate and die when they go to lay their eggs due to the effects of gravity on their massive bodies. Now, the show's very light on the alien ecology, so maybe there's some sort of solution to this that wasn't presented, But let's think about this for a second. First of all, why is a near permanently airborne species still laying eggs on the ground? You'd think they'd evolve such that the females would have either retained some terrestrial ability, or better yet, just switch up their mode of reproduction. Here on Earth, most aquatic reptiles foregoed egg laying and instead independently evolved live birth in some form or fashion. Sea turtles, a handful of sea snake species, and the extinct champsosaurs are among the few examples I can think of that retained egg laying and the females could still actually get around on land to do what they need to do. They're definitely clunky and at risk to predation or other threats, but at least they're not stranding and killing themselves every time they try to reproduce. On that note, it doesn't exactly seem like a great strategy for half of your breeding age population, specifically all the critical individuals, aka breeding age females, to die every breeding cycle without actually having provided anything to their young in the process. Earth animals where females die during breeding tend to do so because of the energy-intensive commitment of incubation. Octopus mothers, for example, starve to death since they stay with their eggs for months, but in that time they constantly provide those eggs with oxygen and protection. Some spider mothers actually induce a predatory response in their newly hatched offspring that results in the babies cannibalizing them when food resources are low. Female sky grazers don't seem to provide anything of value to their offspring. They die within minutes of laying their eggs. They don't seem to use nests or even bury their eggs. Their carcasses don't provide any nutrients since the young don't seem to eat them, and they can't even lay the eggs near enough to a cliffside without the babies having to make an arduous journey by themselves, during which time we see that they're extremely vulnerable to predation. On top of that, this scene implies that only a handful of the small number of babies produced by each female actually make it past their first year of life, let alone get to a reproductive age, and that's assuming that any females from a given clutch actually survive. I mean, sure, evolution doesn't necessarily lead to ideal situations for a given species or individual, but none of this amounts to a feasible reproductive strategy to me. There are plenty of other examples that I noticed throughout the show, with each episode featuring at least a few mildly eyebrow-raising elements, if not full-on blatant issues. The third episode provides the most examples of this show's iffy alien biology and ecology, to the point that a discussion of them in full would be much better suited as its own video, but it also has some of the most blatant examples of the other major problem I have with alien worlds. For some reason, this show seems to have no idea of what it needs to focus on in order to explain the concepts it brings up. Oftentimes, the real-world examples it uses have little to nothing to do with the subjects relating to the aliens. Almost the entire show is like this, but let me use 3 back-to-back-to-back examples from Eden to really drive this point home. First, we get an introduction to the reproductive cycle of these creatures that the show just calls grazers, even though something like moth bunnies would have been a marketably cute, if cheesy, name that I'm going to be using from now on. Moth bunnies are said to be under so much predation pressure that they don't spend time finding a mate, though the show had just finished talking about how hummingbird metabolisms are so fast that they burn through all their energy and constantly need to eat. So, already off to a poor start in this regard by not making that connection. Anyway, instead, they have detachable autonomous genitals that seek each other out and do the mating. It sounds like a crazy idea, and the rest of this reproductive cycle really doesn't make any sense given what's shown, but again, that's for a future discussion. But there's an actual real-world basis for this in the form of polychaete worms. However, the show doesn't go on to talk about polychaetes. Instead, it jumps to a segment about guppies in Trinidad and how the presence or absence of predators can have a dramatic effect on the size and number of their young. It's an impressive example of how a single environmental factor can result in 2 completely different reproductive strategies in the same species of fish, with the 2 guppy populations living only a few yards away from each other in the same stream, and the only thing separating them is a small waterfall. But as cool as this is, it's got nearly nothing to do with the moth bunny's reproductive practices, aside from the loose thread of predation pressure. Then the next alien segment comes, where we get the setup for a nasty life cycle of the fungi that the moth bunnies feed on. The fungi shoot spores into the faces of the unsuspecting moth bunnies, presumably releasing a toxin that removes their fear response and makes them freeze instead of run when faced by predators, making them easy targets for what I've been calling the xenomaurice, since the show just calls them predators. The writers seemingly just gave up on giving the aliens names after the second episode. Themselves infected and poisoned by the spores, the xenomaurice start to drop dead, with Okonedo telling us that this is exactly what the fungus, for lack of a better term, wanted. Alright, so we've got ourselves a classic case of a behavior-altering parasite. Plenty of Earth examples to compare that to, that this was clearly drawn from. Which one does the show present? None. Instead, it brings us to a segment about the symbiotic relationship between the honey guide bird and the hunter-gathering Hadza people in Tanzania, with a man named Palongo talking about how the birds help him find beehives, and he in turn shares the honey with them. It's an interesting practice that I've actually never seen on screen before, and as someone who's taken some anthropology courses, it's a refreshing change to learn about Hadza life from the Hadza themselves as opposed to them being objects of study by some Ivy League postdoc. But again, what does this have to do with the alien stuff we just saw? The harmonious relationship between the birds and the humans is the complete opposite of fungal parasitism, so why is this here? What purpose does this scene serve? At this point, I wasn't sure if the writers of this show hadn't consumed some fungi themselves, especially since they ended up referring to the fungus moth bunny xenomorph relationship as
a deadly three-way symbiosis.
I'm sorry, if a relationship between two or more organisms is deadly, then by definition, it's not symbiosis. This is freaking elementary or middle school level biology. How does a team of writers for a nature documentary make this much of an error? And in the most ecology-themed episode to boot. Anyway, when the show returns to Eden, we see the ultimate end goal of the fungus life cycle, as new stalks grow from the bodies of the deceased xenomorphs. Then the show goes back to Earth to talk about the ecological role of fungi in forests and how some species create these vast systems of nutrient distribution in an actual symbiotic relationship with plants, forming the so-called Wood Wide Web. I've been meaning to learn more about plants and fungi for a while now, so stuff like this is really fascinating, and I'm glad it's getting airtime in front of millions of eyeballs, but at the risk of being repetitive, once again, this has little to do with the alien stuff. Why would you present a parasitic alien fungus, not talk about the hundreds of Earth examples that it was drawn from, and instead bring up two examples of symbiosis, the first of which doesn't even feature a fungus? It makes no sense at all. What the hell was going on with the show's production? Altogether, these 6 segments that I just described comprise about 20 minutes of the episode's 40-minute runtime, and it's smack dab in the middle of the show. Again, this happens throughout all 4 episodes. I just had to explicitly mention Eden because it was a uniquely poor triple whammy of bad SciComm. Because of this, Alien Worlds feels like the product of somebody who was trying to cram an essay together but didn't know much about the topic they were supposed to be covering, so they brought in all these tangential things and connected them with the thinnest of through lines. It reminds me of how in elementary school they teach us how to make connections, and some kids were struggling to grasp the concept of what was relevant to bring up to support their point or address the question asked. So you'd see some kid talking about, yesterday my dad and I went to the store and bought purple grape juice, and the teacher would be like, yes Timmy, but I asked you to tell me about your favorite color and why you liked it. Alright, maybe the examples in school weren't that bad, but that's what watching this show feels like. I'm honestly baffled at how such a massively flawed script got approved. Were they just unable to get or use footage from more relevant examples and had to string together what they had? A simple matter of budget alone couldn't have been that much of a problem, right? I'm sure Framestore isn't cheap to commission, and this is Netflix we're talking about. They're a long-time multi-billion-dollar company with ample money to throw at original projects out the wazoo. Not only is it embarrassingly amateurish from a basic writing perspective, but it detracts from the actual point of the show, which is supposed to be presenting reasoned speculation about alien life. The show already barely has enough footage from each of the episodes to stitch together a solid 4 to 5 minutes worth of unbroken alien content, and it barely dusts off, let alone scratches, the surface of its planet's ecologies. Whatever ground they could make up for with the Earth comparison segments is almost completely squandered by these largely surface-level, off-topic diversions, and it really is a shame to see such well-shot and by themselves interesting segments go to waste like this. All that said, I don't hate Alien Worlds. I appreciate what it tried to do and the tone it tried to strike in balancing astrobiological speculation with actual science, and its production value does make it a very nice show to look at. It's described as a miniseries, and the 4 episodes are collectively listed as Season 1, so while I doubt a second season is coming, I would still give it another chance if another batch of episodes were actually produced. For now though, I can't say that this is a must-watch. Certainly not worth signing up for a subscription for if you don't have Netflix already or a friend to mooch off of. If you do though, and you want to give it a look, by all means go ahead and do so. I think there's just enough between the visuals, the Earth-related info, and the representation of scientific diversity in terms of both the subjects and the researchers themselves for viewers to get something out of this show, however slim. Most of the social media reviews I've seen are actually quite positive, so clearly something worked for those folks, and more power to them. Maybe I'm just a more critical viewer than most when it comes to this stuff. If you're really looking for a speculative astrobiology documentary though, I suggest you check out the aforementioned Alien Planet and Extraterrestrial, as well as Life Beyond by the YouTube channel Melody Sheep, which has been getting a lot of praise lately, especially in the last few weeks. As for the Netflix show, Alien Worlds gets a 6 out of 10 from me. It's aight. Hopefully you enjoyed this random thought salad. Obviously, the topic is a bit different than anything else I've done so far, but this is my channel, and I think I made a decent case for why it fits, so it is what it is. Might make a second video on this, going more in depth with the alien biology and the issues I had with it, but that all depends on whether it's something enough people want to watch. I also want to wait and see what paleontologist Darren Naish has to say about it, since he was involved in at least some of the creature design and has a professional interest in speculative evolution. This will probably be my last video of the year, so hope you had a happy holiday season, and if you follow the Gregorian calendar anyway, have a happy new year. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in 2021.